Welcome back to the Polaris Energy Finance Podcast. Now, today's guest has spent decades at the intersection of economics, energy, and environmental policy. Brian Murray is the director of the Nicholas Institute for Energy, Environment, and Sustainability at Duke University, where he leads one of the country's most prominent research organizations working on energy and climate solutions. He's also a research professor at Duke's Nicholas School of the Environment and the Stanford School of Public Policy. Brian is among the original architects of the allowance price reserve, the cost containment mechanism now embedded in both California's cap and trade program and the regional greenhouse gas initiative. He served on the National Academy of Sciences panel examining how the federal tax code shapes energy-related emissions and was a convening lead author for the IPCC's report on greenhouse gas mitigation from land use change. In 2015, he was a Fulbright Scholar in Environment Economy at the University of Ottawa. His research spans the full toolkit of climate policy, including carbon taxes, cap and trade, tax credits, tradable performance standards, renewable energy markets, and sustainable land use, always through the lens of how economic design shapes real-world outcomes. Brian, welcome to the show. I've had the pleasure of knowing you for the past 2 years since joining Duke as an environmental or a Master of Environmental Management student, and have had the privilege to work with you and interface with you across multiple occasions. So there's no doubt that I'm going to have a lot of questions for you. But to start things off, I think you've really had a fascinating arc. You started in forest and land use economics, moved into carbon markets in the late 90s when it was just starting out, I think. And now you're leading a major energy and climate institute where I've had the privilege of working at a moment when energy policy globally is going through more turbulence than maybe, I think, any time in recent memory. So when you look back at that arc, what's sort of the through line for you? What is it about the economics of energy that's held your attention for this long?
So, Terry, I guess what I would say is since the very beginning, I've always looked at things that are a match of my interests, what I feel is important to work on. In other words, there are people outside of me who are really interested in looking for solutions in that space. And then also what my skill set is, because there can be things that really interest me and are important, but I'm not really well equipped to weigh in on. And when I started my career in the 1980s, that topic was forest conservation. And my interests were developed there in part because I worked as a tree planter in the national forests of the Pacific Northwest, and really got deeply interested, passionate about forest conservation. And so I really dedicated my master's degree, my PhD. I worked for a few years in consulting before I went back to graduate school, focused on problems in the forest and land use sector. And basically, I worked in that area. I was interested in everything from national forest timber policy to the way that the U.S. tax code affects land use decisions. So when I finished up at Duke, I got my PhD here. I went and worked for Research Triangle Institute, which is now known as RTI International, located right here in the Triangle. And at that point, my goal was to expand the types of topics and the types of issues that I worked on. So not just forestry, but looking across environmental problems in multiple sectors. I wanted to view myself more as an environmental and resource economist than specifically a forest economist or forest policy person. And my time at RTI gave me tremendous opportunity to excel. I was working in the chemical industry, the pharmaceutical industry, working on bacterial infections in oysters, so it was a wide range of things. And I found that very satisfying, fulfilling, and expanding. However, at one point, somebody who knew about my work in forests, who was then leading efforts for the US EPA, in fact, was a Duke alum as well. So that's how he knew of my interest in forest, came to me and said, we really want to take a look at the effects that forests and the forest carbon cycle might have on mitigating climate change risks. And we want to look at it from the perspective of if you created a market for this type of activity, what might that look like and how might that interact with timber markets and agricultural markets? So I said, sure, that sounds great. And so I really dug in deeply there. And I'd say throughout the, uh, you know, mid 90s to the early 2000s, I was deeply involved in this. I was doing work for the US government on forest carbon sequestration incentives. I was asked by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change to be a convening lead author for the special report on land use change, and forestry. I was working a lot on efforts to avoid deforestation. And this really hit the 3 points that I said earlier. It was of interest to me. It was really important. And I seemed to have a skill set. And that skill set was not just economics, but it was also a result of the interdisciplinary education I received here at Duke, which was to learn a lot more about forest science and natural systems. So given that the climate change was really kind of the key environmental issue I was focusing on, and I was looking at the effects of forest carbon, it became pretty clear to me that even though forests were an understudied and underappreciated problem and set of solutions to climate change, really the game was going to be played significantly in the energy sector. So I started to develop more and more of an interest in the energy sector. And part of that was through, again, these market mechanisms like carbon markets. If you really needed to understand how they worked, and including how the forest sector worked with the rest of the economy, you really needed to understand the energy sector. So I became more and more interested in the energy sector and developed more and more knowledge in that base. And the broader work I was doing on carbon markets and carbon pricing really had to tackle that head on. So the work that you mentioned earlier in the introduction, like the allowance price reserve, that was cutting across. That was a mechanism in these cap and trade programs, carbon pricing programs, that can help keep the prices in these programs from getting too high, which creates a political vulnerability. So I used this knowledge to really dig in deep in energy. And then around 2016, the provost at Duke University asked me to head the Duke University Energy Initiative. So then I was really all in energy. And now, that was my gig for 6 years. And then we, in 2021, started the process of merging the Duke University Energy Initiative with the Nicholas Institute for Environmental Policy Solutions, which is what we were called at the time, to create now the Nicholas Institute for Energy, Environment, and Sustainability. So I'm still primarily focused on energy, but our portfolio at the Nicholas Institute is broader than energy. So I'm re-exercising some of my muscles developed in agriculture, forestry, land use, and nature-based solutions.
Very fascinating. To sort of like, champion all of these new initiatives that have been so definitive, not just in the US, I think globally, really, all these policy tools that you contributed to also, doing your PhD at Duke and now coming back to Duke after those years to be the director of the Nicholas Institute. I think it's such a full circle moment. Before we dig deeper into that, just out of personal curiosity, I want to ask, you've worked on a lot of landmark policy solutions in the environmental space, and at a time when all of this, I think, was relatively new to a lot of stakeholders, including decision makers, businesses, even academia. So I'm just curious, how do you champion these new environmental solutions and talk to different stakeholders and help them understand what these technical solutions mean to them?
Well, I think I would not. So I wouldn't use the word champion, and that's actually really part of my answer. It's actually central to my answer, which is you go into those stakeholder conversations trying to understand what they need to know, what problem is facing them. We like to say at the Nicholas Institute, and I'd say this sort of has embodied my whole career, is we operate in sort of an if-then proposition, which is it's the stakeholders who may come to you and say, listen, if I'm going to address this type of environmental problem, and I'll use this, and then how do I design that appropriately? What do I need to be thinking about? So back to this example that I just talked about and that you brought up earlier about putting a price reserve mechanism for a cap and trade program, a carbon pricing program. Back almost 20 years ago now, there were members of Congress that were coming to us at the Nicholas Institute saying, we want to design a cap and trade system, but we're very concerned about what would happen to the prices if we ramp down the limits, the cap. And, I can go into that more if you want to get super wonky about how a cap and trade program works, but basically it limits emissions in the economy, and then it allows the permits that regulated entities have to have. It allows them to trade amongst each other, and when you trade amongst each other, that creates a price. So they're concerned if the market gets too tight, the price might get too high, and they know that if that's a proposition, they're probably not going to get it passed through Congress. So how do they address this? So we develop mechanisms that were really firmly rooted in economic theory and practice, and aligned with what the environmental objectives were of this committee. So that's what I mean by I've never, or maybe I have, but if I have, it's been very seldom, ever gone into a conversation and say, here's an idea that I'm going to champion, and it's up to me to convince you that this is the way out. We don't operate that way. That comes a little bit too close to political advocacy. I think that for both in terms of the DNA of our organization, and frankly, universities are to be sources of knowledge, not political advocacy.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's a very nice segue into the question that I was going to ask next. I've had the privilege of working with the Nicholas Institute as a research assistant for a bit, and also being at Duke. The Nicholas Institute leads so many amazing initiatives in energy, environment, sustainability. So you bring a lot of researchers, students, and decision makers into the same room. And to go back to your earlier example of how the decision makers in DC were coming to the Institute to understand cap and trade, what does the Nicholas Institute do that a think tank in DC or even a consulting firm couldn't do?
Yeah. Well, for one thing, and depending on the type of organization, I'll point back to my last comment about political advocacy and championing specific causes. We try to, this may sound, I don't know what it would sound like, but we try to champion the use of the best knowledge, the best information, the best research and science-based set of solutions, and match those with a problem that somebody has. There are other organizations that do that, but one of the advantages that we have at the Nicholas Institute is we're tied to this tremendous university with great talent in the faculty and the students. Now, you mentioned you've worked with us, right? So you're amongst the best that we've ever had, but we have other students as well who that just expands our talent pool. And we're able to, and that works in both directions. So we have expertise at Duke University that sits outside of the Nicholas Institute, that we can bring to the table, whether it's faculty or students. And then we have this platform, we have this network of stakeholders, decision makers in the public and private sector, who are the perfect audience for experiential learning for students and for making sure that the impact of the research that's being done at Duke by researchers who might otherwise just say, my only goal is to get this published in a journal, to actually make that be more actionable in the shorter term than it might otherwise be if it sat on the shelf of a library collecting dust, or these days sitting on a hard drive somewhere collecting dust.
Totally. And I think the Nicholas Institute is honestly very profoundly well positioned on those fronts as well. The Nicholas Institute has an amazing portfolio of programs. Just to name a few, we have the the analytics lab, the energy access project, amazing researchers doing fantastic work at the institute with students and with the wider global network. And we also had the Duke climate commitment in 2022, and we had amazing research come out of the Nicholas Institute on data centers and grid, which we'll touch on later in the podcast. But from your seat and just looking back into the universities and also the global energy and climate dynamic change over the past 2 decades, really, how is Duke positioning itself differently from peer universities on energy and climate? And what's the bet you're making, but also what's a lesson that others can learn from the success of the Nicholas Institute?
Sure. I think so. One of the things is to understand that the Nicholas Institute is connective tissue that operates across all of the schools at Duke, right? So we have a wonderful family, the Nicholas family, who back in the 1990s gave a major gift to essentially create the Nicholas School environment. Um, or to name it, it was called the school environment at the time, and helped lead it to excellence in research and education in fields of environment. I think back in the 1990s, actually, energy was not a big part of the story at the Nicholas School of the Environment, but that emerged over time, I think for the same reasons that it emerged personally for me in ways that I described earlier. So not long after that, but back in the 2000 aughts, the first decade of the 21st century, that same family said, what the Nicholas School is doing great on research and education, but what we really want to see do is to be able to have more immediate impact in the policy space, because that's in their view, and with the view, and it's not just the family, but it was the provost and the president of the university at the time, understanding that a lot of what good environmental solutions were going to require a real strong policy lens. And so the Nicholas Institute for Environmental Policy Solutions, again, sort of, let's just call it the Legacy Institute, was created at that time with that very specific mission to be a bridge from the university to decision makers, particularly public policy decision makers in Washington, D.C. And, I remember I was the second person that was hired by the Nicholas Institute by my predecessor and now colleague, Tim Perfetto, who was the founding director of the Nicholas Institute. And we had a team of 3 or 4 people, and we were being pulled into some of the biggest conversations imaginable. And this was really exciting. But we were coming at it far differently than I think any university was, which was we had some of those characteristics of a think tank or an NGO, which is like action orientation, network building. But we were doing it from the foundation of a world-class university that could provide even greater depth of knowledge that could be used and kind of vectored towards solutions, particularly policy solutions to those problems. So we were, to some people that may sound kind of confusing, but if you're operating in a university, you understand how different that is. And it wasn't always easy to make that work within a university, because universities, and even universities like Duke that are highly interdisciplinary, very entrepreneurial and innovative in our approach to things, there's still, people still operate often in silos of depth, and depth is a good thing. But they might see efforts to cut across silos as something that undermines depth. I don't believe that to be the case. I think there's always room for depth. And what we're trying to do is draw deep knowledge across different sectors, across different disciplines, to address the most critical environmental and now energy challenges of the day.
Speaking of deep knowledge, one of the most striking publications to come out of the Nicholas Institute in recent years is the Rethinking Load Growth paper by Taya Norris, Tim Perfetta, Dahlia, and Adam. It's now the most downloaded publication the Institute has produced in 20 years. The headline finding for our listeners, which they should read the paper, is that the existing U.S. grid could accommodate 76 to 126 gigawatts of new flexible load, basically all of the projected near-term AI and data center growth, if large customers accept short duration curtailment. And we have follow-on work coming from the Institute actively suggesting this flexibility could cut new gas capacity investment by 10 to 50% and shift investment towards various different renewable energy sources, amplifying the U.S. AI growth and advancements. So, Brian, could you help our listeners understand the significance of that finding in the context of the Institute's history that you were describing and how it is advancing energy and environment policy at Duke and beyond? And when this paper landed in February 2025, what was the policy and industry reaction and what's changed since?
Yeah, Terry, this is such a perfect example of what we've been talking about for the last several minutes. And why I think we at the Nicholas Institute and Duke are uniquely positioned to tackle these problems. So that paper you're talking about was also another well-known energy podcast declared it the most impactful thing out of a university on energy in 2025. So that's great. We all love our accolades and we like to pat ourselves on the back, but I want to take you down a journey through how we got there. So as a big part of what we do is we convene stakeholders. Okay. And in this particular case, the stakeholders we would convene would be energy and environmental regulators from the southeastern states. We call it the Southeastern Energy and Environmental Leadership Forum, or SELF. And we have been doing this for about 10 or 15 years, sort of started back at the beginning of the Obama administration when the federal government was going to be getting serious, or more serious, I should say, about energy policy geared towards decarbonization. The states, they're understaffed in terms of their ability to both kind of understand what these federal policies might look like, and then to kind of model out either quantitatively or even qualitatively what it might mean for the state. So we've had this leadership forum for quite a while, and it was in December of 2024. We had a meeting and we were convening, and when I say energy and environmental regulators, I mean, on the energy side, I mean, public utility commissions, basically. On the environment side, they might be environmental air offices who regulate the electric power sector. This was all focused on electric power, I should say. So at that meeting, one of the utility commissioners from one of the states said, hey, we've been talking a lot lately just about how to, we've been operating under the assumption that the demand for electricity will continue to be flat as it has been for the last 20 years. And it's all about shifting the generation sources to meet that flat demand. He said, but we've got a new game in town, which is AI. And AI uses a lot of data, and data uses a lot of data centers. They use a lot of electricity. And now we're actually starting, and it's hard to believe this is only just a few years ago. Now we are actually starting to see that demand for electricity is going up. So it's not going to be flat like we assumed it would be. And it's hard to build new power capacity. There's a whole bunch of reasons for that. And maybe we can get into that later, but it's hard to get these sited. It's hard to get them permitted. The capital's there to build these things, but it's hard to bring them to market fast. And yet we're talking about demand growth that was super fast, right? We're going from trivial growth per year to people are starting to talk about 2, 3, 4% annual growth rate in electricity. And before too long, you don't have the capacity to meet that. So this regulator is saying we need to think harder about how we can use the capacity of the current grid to help meet this demand growth until we can build the new stuff. And that is really when it all came together, because we had the lab, the GRACE lab, in the Nicholas School of the Environment, headed by Professor Dalia Bettina Echeverry, and her PhD student, Tyler Norris, who I'm going to talk about Tyler in just a minute, just about how unique a PhD student he is. We're well positioned to do the modeling to answer the question, how much room is there in the grid that we have right now to expand the use? We're like, well, what do we build the grid for? We build the grid for those few hours a year when it's at maximum peak capacity. And for most of the rest of the year, that capacity sits idle. So at least conceptually, you have an idea, okay, that means that there's unused capacity. We might be able to do something with that. So I do want to say a few words about Tyler and how unusual a PhD student he was. Tyler came to Duke as a PhD student after 15 years of experience in the energy sector, in both the private sector and the public sector. And he was really, and most recently as a renewable energy developer, and he was really kind of captivated by the issue associated with how hard it was to connect new capacity to the grid. So he'd been thinking about these issues. Now he had the technical skill set and modeling to say, well, what happens if when we bring that new demand, the new load onto the grid, if we manage it more flexibly, where for tiny parts of the year, that load may have to be curtailed so that the rest of the grid could be served. And that is the essence of that paper, and showed that we had up to perhaps 100 gigawatts worth of additional capacity that could be tapped into the grid to handle the new load. 100 gigawatts I know this is a energy wonk audience, but that's equivalent to the capacity of about 100 nuclear power plants. So that's not a small amount. And so when this happened, okay, so that's great finding. But here's another differentiator, and one worth emphasizing at a university, which is because the Nicholas Institute was set up with this convening network, a dissemination network, and basically an audience of not just interested parties, but parties with agency. We were able to do a first order analysis. We, and really meaning Tyler, Tim, Dahlia, and Adam, were able to do a first order analysis that came up with that 100 gigawatt estimate. And we were able to get it out. We had some internal review of the process. We're very clear about this. This has not been through a journal peer review process, but putting it out there for dissemination and absorption. We got that out. That meeting was in December. We got it out in February. So about 8 weeks later, we had something that was out there. And it really caught fire because it was addressing a really important problem at that time and doing it in very substantive ways. And not trying to say, don't worry about building capacity, but just saying, as I was saying earlier, it's going to take a while to build the capacity. What can we do in the meantime? And how can this be managed? And this was not only picked up by energy efficiency advocates, of which there are many. It was picked up by the utilities. It was picked up by the hyperscalers. When I mean picked up, read, and then the CEO for Constellation Energy mentioned it in his earnings call with his investors. Google got very excited about it. They got so excited about it that Tyler Norris, in addition to being a PhD student at Duke, now is currently the head of markets innovation for Google. And so it has really taken off, and it's been impactful. It's been impactful in DOE policy, in FERC policy, in how RTOs plan to operate. And we don't have the time for all this. We could pull back the onion a little bit and talk about all these different dimensions of how it affected it. But for now, just know that first surge of information has created its own audience, its own set of solutions, and has really turned the debate about how we're going to meet this load growth in a really important new direction.
I remember when the paper first came out and all the noise and the headlines it was making, both externally and internally. And it was a particularly exciting time to be a student at Duke in energy. And I was taking Dahlia's class, I think, at the time when the research was getting published. So it was like attending a Taylor Swift concert and being friends with Taylor Swift at the same time. So such a great moment, and I think that just goes to show the positioning of the Nicholas Institute. We talked about how.
If I could interject
Yeah.
one thing on that, Terry, because I want to make sure that people who are listening to this are not thinking that what we're doing is we're substituting out for peer-reviewed research that goes through journals and that work is going through the peer review process. And we are also continuing to get white papers out, and it's all melded together. It's just a recognition of how important timing is to policy solutions. We're talking about a problem that really needs fairly quick solutions. And journal articles, even the best journal articles, might take 1.5 years to get to publication. So we want to feed the long-term pipeline of knowledge, but also we want to create actionable research that can operate now and can be adapted over time as we learn more.
What is the challenge of that then? I also had the opportunity to publish my research throughout the time working with Professor Loana Lima at the Institute on Data Center Energy Solutions. But the publishing takes a lot of time, as you were saying, through the peer review process. So, how does the Institute manage to work on both those fronts and get actionable um, insights from the research it's doing and inform policymakers and decision makers? So, how do you engage with industry?
Well, first is, I mean, we are transparent when we put something out in 8 weeks that it has, that we've had our own internal peer review process, but not a double blind peer review type of process that the top journals or the state of the science would dictate. So we're upfront about that. But I think the audience understands that they don't want to wait a year and a half for something to come out, and so they sort of take it as it is, and then we also try not to be too we try to be very transparent and modest, if you will, about what the limitations of this are, so that we're not misleading people into kind of corner solutions. So that's critical. And then we continue, and we also put it out there instead of just say go to our website and read the paper. We're always there, available, whether it's through webinars or in-person public appearances. We go out on the road and we get the feedback and we engage in the dialogue with people who might critique it, both positively and negatively. And then often good points are brought up. And so then you modify proposed solutions, or you just say, that's something that a hyperscaler can work on, or a data center developer can work on. How exactly do you curtail at the right time? Right? There are some deep machine learning types of questions that addresses that the people who wrote this paper aren't necessarily, at the time they're writing the paper, are super equipped to answer. But you don't want to propose something that's just unrealistic, where somebody would look at that and say, well, that's great, but you can't do it. No one has really said that. They've said, well, that's a difficult problem, so how do we solve that? And now we're kind of working on solving some of those difficult problems right now.
Sort of moving a bit away from the Institute's, I guess, work, but also just wanted to get your general expertise on various topics. Just drawing from the research that came out of the Institute on data center energy growth, there's been a lot of debate about whether AI-led data growth or load growth is the death knell of the energy transition, or its accelerant on the flip side. And you've engaged this question publicly through both the Institute's work and through your own work. Where do you actually come down on this? Is AI a problem or an opportunity for clean energy deployment?
Yes and yes. Two things can be true at one time. Is it a problem? Yes. I mean, in the sense that, as I was saying earlier, we were kind of going from a mindset of demand is flat. Now we got to, people advocating for a cleaner energy future, saying now it's just a matter of making what we're, serving that load as cleanly as possible, decarbonizing it as fast as possible. That's still an objective. It's just become a bit harder when the load is growing, and especially the nature of that load needs to be instantaneously served. So those are the problems. And some people are concerned that what this is going to do is leave the legacy fossil fuel assets around longer, and maybe even lead to a rebuild of new fossil fuel facilities, particularly natural gas. There's not a lot of conversation about building new coal plants. There's a lot of conversation about, and not only conversation, but policy directives to keep some of the existing coal plants who are slated to retire, to keep them in business. Okay, so that's the problem. The opportunity here is that the hyperscalers, and by the way, by hyperscalers, I mean the Googles, the Metas, the Amazons, the Apples of the world, right? They are the ones who need the compute from data centers to do their AI stuff, as well as other things too. Amazon doesn't just do AI. They need data centers for all of the goods and services that they sell. So the hyperscalers do, to a number, have net zero commitments, and they're still committed to trying to meet those. So there's that. And then there's generally also the sense that some of the fastest speed to market right now, particularly in the United States, in terms of serving that load, actually comes from solar and energy storage combo systems. We've gotten very good and very cheap at building new solar. That wasn't true 10 years ago. And if maybe we could loop back a little bit later to talk about the virtuous cycle between policies that subsidize certain technologies in a way that brings those costs down over time. But we are at that point in solar right now, particularly in high resource areas, where it's relatively inexpensive to generate the electricity, even now when you add batteries and other energy storage technology. So that has only been the case recently. And so building those is often faster than building a new gas plant, or certainly building a new nuclear plant. The incentives, the tax incentives for solar energy in the United States are now being phased out. However, in 2026, it looks like it's going to surpass even 2025 in terms of new capacity installation of solar. Some of that is racing to get out in front of the tax credit, but all of the data and evidence I've seen is solar is going to continue to be strong out into the future, again, because of speed to market and cost considerations. Is it the solution everywhere? No, but it's the solution in a lot more spaces than it was just a few years ago. So in that regard, the fast build out can be good. The real question is, as we get past the next 3 to 5 years, what is the new stuff going to be? How much are solar, wind, nuclear going to contribute? Hydro, geothermal, if we have a minute to talk about geothermal, that would be great. How much are they going to contribute, and how much is new and old coal and new gas going to be contributing to the power mix? I think if I were to look out 5 years from now, 10 years from now, we'll see more renewables in the system than we do now. Right now, even at certain times throughout the year, renewables actually outpace coal and natural gas combined. Not over the whole course of the year, but during certain times of the year that happens. And I wrote an article, or was interviewed for an article about that fairly recently. So there's what I mean by, yes, two things. It's a challenge and it's an opportunity. And so there's still some technical challenges to put renewables on par in terms of reliability and firmness relative to dispatchable fossil and nuclear energy. But that's the tech community and the investment community is well aware of that and is investing heavily in that.
Right. It's both an opportunity, but also a challenge. But I think from challenge comes innovation and new ideas. Moving a bit, along the same lines, actually, in the context of AI load growth and geopolitics, there seems to be a lot of new capital available for energy security within the US and also globally. How do policy and business intersect to deploy that new capital and make that capital available for energy security related technologies while pursuing innovations on the frontiers of various technologies like geothermal at the same time?
So I'll have to ask you, when you talk about energy security in this case, are you talking about the reliability of energy, or are you talking about it like literally as a geopolitical issue, which is front of mind right now for a lot of people?
All of it.
Okay. Well, I think in some senses, what I've been talking about the last several minutes has been about the security from a domestic reliability standpoint. And when it comes to the geopolitics, say right now, at the time of this recording, there's still a war going on right now in Iran. and that is having a significant impact on global markets for oil and even gas. Um, what that means is the price at the pump has skyrocketed everywhere in the world, and it is getting people thinking again. I mean, most parts of the world have been thinking about this for a long time. All parts of the world have been thinking about this for a long time, but policy actions have been differentiated across countries. So there are areas that China, for instance, I'm sure we could have multiple episodes on China. China is a real leader in renewable energy and in electric vehicles. That's been motivated as much as anything by geopolitics of energy supply. They don't produce a lot of oil in China, so they move quicker to electrification of the vehicle fleet there. So Europe has also, it sits on the forefront of the Russia-Ukraine war. They have, if you look at energy transitions of the last 30 years or so, you can look at China as being something that has really accelerated in the last 10 years, and it's been explosive, and it's been focused not just on the domestic market, but on the export market for China. Europe has ridden a steady horse for the last 30 years. They embraced the Kyoto Protocol of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change early on, created their own cap and trade market, put all kinds of policies in place. And there has been a dramatic energy transition, I should say a steady transition in Europe that is now dramatic when you compare what the sector looks like now compared to what it was back in the 1990s. There's been, I believe, over a 50%, a 50% reduction in emissions. The amount of reliance on coal has dropped considerably. And the reliance or the use of both wind and solar has gone up dramatically. So they've really had a steady pace. It has not been whipsawed as much by political considerations as it has in the United States. The United States has also made considerable progress in terms of decarbonizing the economy, and particularly the energy sector. That's been a mix of economic realities and market realities, like natural gas becoming a lot cheaper than coal, but also policy realities by wind and solar becoming less expensive over time, subsidized early on, and then the economies of scale have kicked in to lower the costs associated with that. So what does that mean? The energy sector is global in nature. It's become even more globalized as natural gas and liquefied natural gas has been transportable all over the world. So it does have local and global components to it, but it's really hard to isolate energy effects into any one particular place.
Right. So there's a lot of, I think, moving pieces both domestically for the United States, but also globally in these different political and market realities. And touching a bit on geothermal, which I think is, at least in the United States, bipartisan. So it gets support from both political sides. And internationally, I think the similar sentiments run. Is it helpful to get that sort of political support versus maybe industry engagement? So when we think about energy innovation, we obviously first think about it from a technology perspective, but ultimately the adapters of the technology are in right now, maybe the data centers, the energy companies, and speed to power is very important to them. So like what role does actually policy play in helping the industry understand technology, or does the industry help policymakers understand technology? How does this work?
Again, I'm just going to have to say both things. It's yes and yes, and so you're absolutely right that what happens. I think a lot of people. I teach a first year course in energy policy, and I try to create first year undergrads, so freshmen, and I try to impress upon this early on that. I don't know that everyone really appreciates that in this country and in most countries throughout the world. There are really notable exceptions that the production of energy is a almost purely private sector endeavor, right? So it's not produced by the government. In some cases it is. There are public-private partnerships in the U.S. and there's government-owned and managed, power sources in the United States, like Tennessee Valley Authority, Bonneville Power Administration. But by and large, electricity in this country is produced by investor-owned utilities. Oil and gas, of course, is produced by companies that explore and produce oil and gas. And so we don't get energy without a private sector. And the private sector is driven both by market signals, like pure market signals for the demand for their product and how it's being supplied in the rest of the world, and by policy incentives. And that's true. We've been talking a lot about how true that has been recently for renewable energy and low carbon energy. But it's been true for a very long time also with fossil energy. There are tax breaks that go to the fossil energy sector for exploration and extraction that are attractive and helpful. Would they be able to exist without them? Yes. But it helped kind of deliver a more cost-effective sector over time. And that's what's happening in other sources of energy. So policy and private sector action are separate, but they're very closely related, right? So the policies, if they don't make sense to the private sector, then they're not very good policies. They won't induce the type of action that the policymakers want. And policies can really divert and attract capital in ways that can be helpful to the private sector or harmful. And I think one of the things you wanted to ask me about was that, like what either keeps me up at night, or I don't know if it keeps me up at night, but one of my deep concerns that I have is how to create a durable energy policy for the U.S. and not have it go whiplash back and forth as a new administration comes into the White House or a new party overtakes Congress, and they spend an inordinate amount of time undoing what the previous administration did. That is not helpful, really, for anybody in the private sector, for consumers. And so what I would like to see happen is more bipartisanship in terms of what an energy policy is. We actually do have elements of that. You mentioned geothermal is a good example of that. Nuclear is another example of that. But there are other energy sources that, kind of are either on a dark list or a light list, and it depends on the political constituencies.
Right. In light of that, actually, wanted to ask you, going back to the Nicholas Institute, what is the role of, I guess, number one, the Nicholas Institute's role in this moment, but also by extension, a research university? Because I think the role of universities are changing, at least in the US, a bit recently. And so, what does success look like for the Nicholas Institute in terms of making an impact in both industry and policymakers across these various, very, very important, relevant topics?
Okay, I'm going to answer in reverse. I'm just going to go to like what the role of a university is. University is where new ideas come from, right? Not all new ideas, but sort of fundamental new ideas come from universities. That's what we've been built for the last millennium. And Duke, for depending on whether you count when we became Duke University 102 years ago or Trinity College back in the 19th century. So we've been around a long time to create new knowledge, and that knowledge feeds in not just to energy and to all kinds of fields. And so there's just the core creation of knowledge. And we have our education mission, which is to prepare future leaders through giving them the best education possible. So where does the Nicholas Institute come into that is that Duke decided about 20 to 25 years ago to create these cross-disciplinary institutes that are problem-focused. Understanding that the sort of the wicked problems of the contemporary day back then, or looking out to the 21st century, we're going to they're complex, they're kind of wicked problems, and they require interdisciplinary solutions. And they also need to be very intentional about feeding the problems that exist outside the university. So we see this in medicine all the time, right? We get universities create new knowledge, and but then they have medical centers that actually apply the knowledge through clinical work, right? So I like to think of what we do at the Institute as having some sort of parallel concept to that, which is we are then a platform for the knowledge that's created at Duke and partner institutions, and delivering it as almost like a form of clinical care to policy and business decision makers about how it can be best applied to their particular ailment, if you will, or their particular problem that they're facing. So the investment that Duke made and the Nicholas family made back in the early 2000s was very much to do this, and then also refortified recently by the merger of the Energy Initiative and the Nicholas Institute to say, and we can do this in a way that just builds an even stronger community in energy and environment at the university. So we're not just a bridge to the outside world, we're like an interconnective crosswalk at Duke University. So I know for some people, they're probably scratching their head and say, what does all that mean? But it's just a more robust institution for having impact on all types of things, but in this particular case, energy, environment, sustainability.
As a Duke student that graduated now, but as a Duke alum who had the privilege to engage with the institute, that is really the impression that I got over the past few years as well. And building on top of that, before we go into the rapid fire round, wanted to ask you. We have a lot of young professionals listening to the podcast, and the energy is a changing world. What's your advice for the next generation of energy and climate professionals? What skills, mindsets, or sectors should they be orienting towards?
Well, we're all drawn by a passion. No one, I don't know if no one, but very few people would sort of accidentally stumble into this field, right? They're drawn to it by a passion, right? Drawn to it by a sense that these are really serious long-term problems and opportunities to dedicate a career to, and they should not lose sight of that. However, in order for them to have impact on the field, they have to develop some skill set, some technical skill set. It doesn't have to just be technical, but I'll kind of start with there. And that could be, modeling, coding, financial analysis, something that kind of can deliver substance and content to the types of problems. I think the mindset has to be not only a curious mindset, a critical thinking mindset. I think one of the things that's hard in this field, as we're drawn by our passion to save the environment, if you will, is to still understand that the types of solutions to, first of all, that's a complicated aspiration and endeavor. Save the environment and also society's interaction with it. So it's just a really complex problem. So understanding that and learning how to be a critical thinker and not get locked into solutions early on where you ignore evidence that suggests that there has to be some sort of course adjustment. I think if we look at how the environmental community has viewed nuclear energy over the last 30 years, I think we can see an evolution of perspective there. And I'm going to use that as an example for how students might be wanting to think about this. I mean, when I first got interested in the environment, it was partly motivated by an album that was produced in 1979 or 1980 called the No Nukes album. It was after the 3 Mile Island, meltdown, which, was a real eye opener. So they're really, so it was definitely anybody who had environmental sensitivities was very much anti-nuclear at the time. No one was even thinking about climate change at that time. And so now, and now here we are 45 years later, and most of the major environmental groups out there, not all of them, and I'm not saying that the problem has been solved and that there are no legitimate concerns left, but most of them will accept the fact that nuclear needs to play some role in the future because it doesn't emit greenhouse gases when it's producing power. And so that's an example, I think, of not getting so locked into technology solutions that you're in favor of, to understand that those perspectives may need to change over time. So we need critical thinking. and we need adaptability to the problems at the time, and we also need to understand that not everyone out there thinks the same way that we do or has the same priorities that we do. And I'm just saying, like, if you're in this mindset that it's us against them, that's a tough road to hoe, because things you talked about, policy doesn't really get solved if only one side of a point of view wins. The great environmental accomplishments of the 1970s in this country were passed and were championed by a Republican president and passed in a bipartisan Congress. We need to return to that kind of bipartisan support for these solutions to these really important problems.
That was a very comprehensive, eye-opening answer, Brian. Really appreciate that. Especially, I think, as a young professional, it was very refreshing to hear to keep an open mind to all of these different energy solutions and technologies that we have. Moving on to some rapid fire questions, and I hope to have some like sound elements when I edit this, like some fire burning sound or something into this. But first question: a book or paper that everyone working in energy should read?
Oh, you mean other than the Nicholas Institute report from 2025 and the ones that have followed that?
Obviously, all of the reports are coming out of the institute.
Yeah, but other than that, I'll tell you, the one book that has been I've felt influential is not just an energy book. And I think a lot of people have read it. It's a New York Times bestseller, and that's Abundance by Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson. Several chapters are devoted to energy, but if I could encapsulate that, it would be, we have gotten not very good in this country at building large-scale projects because we've put a number of laws in place that have been well-intentioned laws, environmental protection often being the goal, that make it just much harder to develop at speed. And that's probably good in a lot of ways. But if we're trying to build out a new energy infrastructure in the next decade that is going to be substantially larger than what we have right now, we need to figure out how to navigate that terrain. And the point of view that is brought up in the book Abundance is that is a challenge that we're having a hard time overcoming.
What is a technology you think is underhyped?
I think so one is, we talked a little bit about it, is geothermal, but it's getting its hype, like it's getting its moment. And it's easier to hype like individual technologies like that, like 5 years ago, small modular reactors, right? Or maybe not 5, 3 years ago. I'm not saying that their day is over, but like they're now in the next kind of phase of pilot testing and experimentation. Geothermal has always been around, but it's been rare and only places where you can deal super deep. Now, some of the technologies that were actually developed for hydraulic fracturing and natural gas have helped open up geothermal energy. And so that has been a very positive. But I think the one that is really underhyped is anything having to do with grid enhancement technology. So making the electric grid, it's hard. Again, I'll say it again. It's really hard to build things in this country right now. But we already have pre-existing transmission lines right now that can be reconducted, that can otherwise be improved. And then everything we're talking about here about how to more flexibly manage the grid, that's software. That's where AI can actually be part of the solution, figuring out smarter ways to manage the electrons that we have within the grid so they can respond to the new needs that are being put on the grid by the new load.
What is the single biggest policy lever the U.S. could pull in the next 12 months?
I think permitting reform. I think given the way you introduced me, you probably thought I would say carbon pricing, but that's not going to happen in the next 12 months. It would be nice if over time we had some sort of carbon pricing mechanism in place. But for now, permitting reform, which is going to require a fair bit of compromise, because in order to get both sides of the aisle behind it, they're going to want to they're not going to want to prescribe that it can only be permitting for certain types of energy, but not other types of energies. It's probably going to have to be more of an all of the above type of approach.
What is one company or organization doing work that you really admire right now?
So I talked about geothermal earlier, and the company that's really made an impact there is Fervo. And so they are, they've broken ground. I think they're going to be the first new geothermal producers in the United States, and it's going to be really interesting to see how that plays out. Then there's another firm that I've been at a lot of I've been on the stage with him once or twice before, and I've been at a lot of conferences, and I follow him on social media, and that's Grid Strategies, headed up by a guy named Rob Gramlich. And Rob used to be at FERC, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, has been with Grid Strategies for a while. He's just a really thoughtful thinker, and somebody with like deep, substantive knowledge and also deep institutional knowledge.
All right, one last question. What makes you optimistic about energy future?
This is going to seem like I'm being obsequious here, I guess, but students like you. I mean, seriously, that the I have the great fortune to spend a lot of my time every day, every week, with young people who are not only fixed on this problem, they not only have the passion to solve problems, but they have a pragmatic mindset. Maybe that's why they come to Duke, because we're sort of a professional school and pragmatic oriented. We're values and mission driven, but we also understand that we have a system that works a certain way now and it needs to be adjusted over time. So I am very optimistic that we are creating a class of future leaders right now that is going to solve is kind of a tough word to use, but it's really going to tackle these problems in ways that are going to be beneficial for society. Then new problems are going to come up, and then we're going to need to continue to train new people. And the people that we're putting out in the workforce right now, in 10 years, are probably going to have to reinvent themselves to do other things. And I think we're providing the right foundation for them to do that, or at least I hope we are.
Well, that 1,000% that you are doing that, Brian. Thank you so much for being a mentor to all of us at Duke University and beyond. And I've had, being part of the young people at Duke working on similar challenges and finding solutions in the energy space. The Nicholas Institute and your leadership has been irreplaceable.
Well, thank you, Terry, and thank you for this opportunity to talk with you. This has been a real pleasure.
Yeah, thank you very much. Before I let you go, I ask this from everybody I invite to my podcast. Who is one person that you think that I should invite to my podcast next?
Rob Gramlich, who I just mentioned earlier. I'll try to make the outreach and connection for you. I think also, well, that was one person. I only get to answer one person.
You can add more if you would like.
Have you had Tyler Norrison?
Not yet. We've had email correspondences, but I haven't had the chance yet. All right. Perfect. Brian, this has been an absolute delight. It's always a pleasure to speak with you. Thank you for the work that you and your team are doing, and thank you for joining me today. And for our listeners, you can follow the Nicholas Institute's fantastic work at the nicholasinstitute.duke.edu website, and Brian's writing on The Hill, Forbes, and elsewhere. We'll link everything in the show notes. Until next time, this is the Polaris Energy Finance Podcast. Thank you.